What a horrible Christmas to have a curse of the moon. Okay, that line sucks. Who wrote this crap and why are they allowed to... Oh, wait. Well, they were clamoring for a new Castlevania game and they got this instead. Now, I wrote that line back in 2021, 2022, and had this video come out much sooner as intended, that would have hit a little differently, I suppose. But considering what's being done with the Castlevania IP as of late, aside from the surprise Haunted Castle revisited on the recent Dominus collection, there are a lot of instances of clamoring for a new Castlevania, but here's some DLC for a game I have no interest in instead. As such, scoffing at the notion of something like Bloodstained Curse of the Moon being the closest thing to a new Castlevania-like game, simply based on the pedigree of who's heading that Bloodstained enterprise, I find that notion somewhat silly. Perhaps even more so now because Bloodstained is something that has enough of a decent track record with 3 games under its belt that it really doesn't need that comparison outside of comparing some play mechanics here and there. If anything, at this moment, I'm really just clamoring for a brand new standalone Bloodstained game because now that's long overdue. Yes, I know about Classic 2, that could have been its own game and not just DLC tied to a much better game, I guess, I don't know, I haven't played it yet, I did download it, but anyways. This is Bloodstained Curse of the Moon, a 2018 release from Inti Creates for a whole bunch of systems, including today's subject matter, Nintendo Switch. Though this was released after the announcement and success of the Ritual of the Night campaign to fund the bigger project, Curse of the Moon was the first Bloodstained game to actually see release, as Ritual of the Night wouldn't be available to the masses until the following year, and then Curse of the Moon would get a sequel in 2020, and that's as far as the Bloodstained train goes for the time being. At least until they eventually announce a new game, which again is long overdue at this point. I'd say that about a lot of series I enjoy nowadays, and it's rather quite sad. Magical Dora P2 when you fucking have. Anyway, what we have here is an 8-bit styled side-scrolling platform game which places you in the role of Zangetsu, a hunter dude cursed by demons and he wants to kill all the demons as a result. Nice achievable goal, I think. As he ventures through the game's 7 stages, 8, whatever, he will encounter other characters, mostly the other major players in that other Bloodstained game. And he can either have them join him on his quest, leave him behind, or he can kill them and acquire some extra abilities such as an arcing aerial attack, double jump, and other bits and bobs. But killing allies is frowned upon in Curse of the Moon because then we'd have no franchise. So the game offers an option to go back in time and redo your bad decision making. I mean, how dare you kill your potential buddies? That's a bit of a dick move. Besides, you'll eventually unlock an ultimate mode that lets you keep everything, cool moves, weird friends. Have fun, I guess. Anyway, your potential allies are Miriam, the protagonist of that Bloodstained Symphony of the Night game or whatever. She uses a whip and can slide under narrow passages. Alfred, an alchemist who can cast spells but only has a sliver of health. And the last ally is Jebel, your Alucard stand-in with the ability to transform into a bat, as well as possessing a bit of a limited bat attack. I presume this takes place before the eventual heel turn. Sorry if I spoiled the movie for anybody. Naturally, one would assume this is aping the style of Castlevania 3's Spirit system, but Curse of the Moon goes a step further in that you could have multiple allies on your team as opposed to just one at a time, and each character has their own life meter as opposed to sharing the one, which is actually an improvement. This also affects the way lives work. Normally, when you die via health drainage or falling into a pit, you lose a life. Here, when you have multiple characters on your team and one of them dies, the game switches to the next available character on your team, and once your entire party is wiped out, then you lose a life and restart at a checkpoint that you passed. Honestly, this is a nice touch because not only does it give you more lives than advertised, but in a way, it's a good additional incentive to invite some allies to the fray rather than doing away with them. Sure, you could get a couple extra abilities, but without the extra bodies, you have fewer chances to complete a stage before the eventual game over. And honestly, the only thing the game over does is reset your score, and if you don't care for score beyond a means of getting extra lives every few thousand points, then you could continue along your merry way unabated, either on the spot or via save functionality, of which the game gives you a generous dozenish slots for you to splurge, as it were. Much appreciated since the game has multiple modes of play, some of which you eventually have to unlock. So yeah, Curse of the Moon's inspirations of sorts is largely based on the classic-vania era of 8-bit games that graced your Nintendo Entertainment Systems and Game Boys. That much is apparent with the graphical and audio bits. It's also somewhat apparent with the gameplay, and it is sadly also readily apparent with the controls, and that of course means that you've got some stiff jumping that you cannot control in midair, fairly limited stair controls, you could jump on but not off stairs, fun. Look, most of us love those old Castlevanias, but there was a time when that franchise had moved beyond the 8-bit era and introduced new mechanics and such that made the gameplay and control better, basically evolving what the series could have been before it moved in another direction entirely, but that's a stylistic choice. And for what it's worth, control does work and it's fairly easy to figure out, and you can rebind keys if desired, so that's something. But I'm just, whatever, it's gonna fall on deaf ears and nobody's gonna care. Curse of the Moon has about 9 levels of play, but they're fairly sizable levels with multiple paths that you could take to reach the end boss. These paths usually require an ability to access them and are another means of reaching the end of the level, so it's not completely non-linear, but it's something to give players incentive to try different things to explore as much of these levels as possible. Aside from a choice of difficulty, including some unlockable difficulty settings, the game gives you an extra couple modes earned upon beating the game. A nightmare mode, essentially a second quest of sorts, that continues the main story and also features a different final stage, and also an ultimate mode that lets you have it all. There's a boss rush waiting to be unlocked if you care for such things. There's some stuff there. Curse of the Moon adopts a similar pseudo 8-bit pixel art style that you see in a lot of these pseudo 8-bit things. Game basically looks like a higher end NES game with lots of detailed backdrops and larger characters, but fairly basic looking smaller characters, further enhanced with extra colors and animations that would have been otherwise impossible on the old hardware. The novelty on this style has long since worn off by this point, but for what it's worth, it's a fine looking game. Not at all surprising considering Inti Create's track record with this sort of thing, and they do a fine job in taking a lot of the familiar bosses and characters from the main Bloodstained game and converting it within the self-imposed constraints of this current format. Credit where it's due, when you do good stuff in this style, it looks really good. Shocking revelation, I'm sure. To go along with the pseudo-NES looking visuals, you've got the pseudo-NES sounding sound effects and chiptunes. The sound effects are, well, they are what they are. They sound like sound effects from 8-bit hardware, perhaps a bit richer in some places, but that's about it really. They're nice sound effects if nothing else, but that's about it really. The music is a highlight, and if I'm being honest, I actually prefer the tracks in this Curse of the Moon game than I do in Ritual of the Night. Maybe it's because I'm a sucker for really good chip music that has a hint of the VRC6, but there's some genuinely good moody tunes in here, and even a couple themes from Ritual get the 8-bit downgrade, so to speak, and they sound a bit better here, to be quite honest. But that's just me. Bloodstained Curse of the Moon is a damn fine action game. Fairly straightforward on the surface, but does have enough depth and additional modes and bits and bobs that merit further playthroughs, especially if you're a fan of this style of action platform game. And while Curse of the Moon doesn't evoke that feeling of nostalgia for me despite ties to its source of inspiration, that didn't affect the whole package, and honestly, that wasn't needed to enjoy what I feel is just a really great throwback that doesn't entirely throw back and still feels somewhat fresh and exciting, for the time at least. Nowadays, games like this are a dime a dozen, but Curse of the Moon is still a fun time had by all. And if you enjoy the old classic Vania gameplay of the 8-bit days and want more of that, well, this is a fairly good imitation at least, but still a grand old time regardless. Well worth checking out if you haven't already.